I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped through the Callahans' front door. The invitation had been slipped under my apartment door 3 days prior, written in careful cursive on cream-colored paper that felt expensive between my fingers. "Join us for an evening celebration," it read, with my name spelled perfectly despite the fact that I'd only lived in the neighborhood for 6 months. The house was decorated with string lights that cast long, dancing shadows across the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a wake than a celebration. Neighbors I barely knew smiled at me with rehearsed warmth, their eyes lingering a moment too long before they turned away. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down approached me with a wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly as she handed it over. "So glad you could make it, dear," she said, but her voice carried an undertone I couldn't quite place. Fear? Excitement? I couldn't tell, but it made my skin crawl nonetheless. The living room was filled with familiar faces, people I'd waved to while getting my mail or walking to my car. Tonight, however, they seemed different. Their conversations felt forced, punctuated by glances in my direction that made me increasingly uncomfortable. I tried to blend into the background, finding a spot near the mantelpiece where I could observe without drawing attention. That's when I noticed the family photographs lining the hallway. At first glance, they appeared normal, typical family portraits and vacation snapshots. But as I moved closer, something felt off. The faces in the older photographs seemed blurred, as if they'd been deliberately obscured. Some frames contained pictures that looked like they'd been taken through windows, showing people who appeared unaware they were being photographed. My stomach dropped when I recognized one of the subjects. It was me, captured through what must have been my kitchen window, washing dishes 3 nights ago. My hands began to shake as I scanned the other frames, finding more images of myself going about my daily routine, getting mail, walking to my car, sitting on my balcony with my morning coffee. Beautiful collection, isn't it? Mr. Callahan's voice made me jump. He'd appeared beside me without making a sound, his eyes fixed on the photographs with obvious pride. We've been curating it for quite some time. These are... I struggled to find words, my throat suddenly dry. These are pictures of me. Of course they are. His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. We like to document our neighborhood family. Everyone who belongs here gets added to the collection eventually. I backed away from the wall, my pulse hammering against my temples. "You've been watching me, taking pictures without my permission?" Watching is such an ugly word. Mrs. Henderson had joined us, her wine glass still trembling in her grip. We prefer to think of it as caring, getting to know our neighbors properly. Other guests had begun to drift toward us, forming a loose semicircle that blocked my path back to the main room. Their faces held the same unsettling mixture of anticipation and something that looked almost like hunger. The string lights flickered once, casting grotesque shadows that made their expressions appear even more sinister. "The collection is almost complete," someone said from behind me. I spun around to see an elderly man I didn't recognize, his camera hanging around his neck like a professional photographer. Just a few more shots needed for the final arrangement. What final arrangement? My voice came out smaller than I intended, barely above a whisper. Mr. Callahan checked his watch, a gold piece that caught the light as he angled his wrist. Midnight approaches. That's when we usually finish our documentation projects. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see my breath forming small clouds as panic began to set in properly. These people had been stalking me for months, building some kind of disturbing shrine to my daily life, and now they were talking about completing their collection. "I need to leave," I said, pushing past Mrs. Henderson toward the front door. "Oh, but you can't leave yet," she called after me, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The deadbolt had been engaged from the inside, and there was no key in sight. My hands fumbled desperately with the lock as footsteps approached from behind. "The midnight photograph is very special," the photographer explained, his voice getting closer. "It captures the subject at their most authentic moment, usually right around the time they realize what's happening." I spun around to face them, my back pressed against a door. The entire party had gathered in the hallway now, their faces illuminated by the flickering string lights. Some held cameras of their own, others clutched printed photographs I recognized as images of myself taken over the past several months. "You see, we had a neighbor before you," Mr. Callahan continued, his tone conversational despite the horror of the situation. "Lovely young man, very photogenic, but he moved away before we could complete his collection. Such a disappointment. What happened to him?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. The silence that followed was deafening. Several neighbors exchanged glances that spoke volumes without saying anything. Mrs. Henderson's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor with a sound like breaking bones. "He became part of the permanent collection," the photographer said finally, adjusting the settings on his camera. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I thought about the missing person posters I'd seen around town when I first moved in, featuring a young man with kind eyes and a nervous smile. The posters had disappeared after a few weeks, and I assumed he'd been found safe. "Please," I whispered, pressing myself harder against the door. "I won't tell anyone. I'll move away, just like he was supposed to." "But that's the problem," Mr. Callahan said, pulling out his phone and showing me a screen of photographs. Recent ones, taken tonight, showing me discovering their collection and realizing the truth. The midnight photograph has already begun. The camera flashes started then, a blinding strobe effect that disoriented me completely. I covered my eyes, but the light seemed to penetrate my eyelids, creating painful white spots in my vision. Through the chaos, I heard the mechanical clicks of multiple cameras, documenting my terror from every angle. When the flashing stopped, I found myself surrounded by a circle of neighbors, all holding printouts of the photographs they'd just taken. My face stared back at me from dozens of images, each one capturing a different moment of my growing horror. The fear in my eyes looked so genuine, so raw, that I understood why they called it the midnight photograph. "Now the collection is complete," Mrs. Henderson said, her earlier nervousness replaced by satisfied calm. "Welcome to the permanent gallery." The lights went out completely then, plunging us into absolute darkness. I felt hands grabbing my arms, my shoulders, guiding me away from the door and deeper into the house. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if my voice had been stolen along with my freedom. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of footsteps on stairs, going down instead of up, leading me toward whatever basement gallery they'd mentioned. The permanent collection, where neighbors went when their documentation was complete. When I woke up, I was in a room lined with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering every inch of wall from floor to ceiling. Pictures of people I didn't recognize, captured in moments of ordinary life and extraordinary terror. At the center of the far wall, in a place of honor, hung a series of images I recognized immediately. They were all of me. Story 2. The Children's Exchange. The invitation to the Blackwood family's annual gathering arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by their youngest daughter, who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She handed it to my mother with trembling fingers and ran away before anyone could say thank you. The heavy cardstock felt expensive, embossed with gold lettering that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. "How lovely," my mother said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "The Blackwoods haven't hosted in years." I was 15 then, old enough to notice the way adults sometimes said things that sounded pleasant but felt wrong underneath. The way my mother's voice carried a note of forced cheerfulness, or how she kept glancing toward the Blackwood mansion at the end of our street with an expression I couldn't quite read. The house itself had always unsettled me. It was a Victorian monstrosity that loomed over our modest suburban neighborhood like a dark secret everyone agreed not to discuss. 3 stories of weathered brick and twisted iron, with windows that seemed to watch you as you passed by on the sidewalk. The Blackwood family rarely ventured out during daylight hours, and their children attended private schools that none of us had ever heard of. Saturday evening came faster than I wanted it to. My mother insisted I wear my best clothes, despite the fact that it was supposed to be a casual neighborhood gathering. She fussed over my hair and straightened my collar with nervous energy that made me increasingly anxious about the whole affair. "Remember to be polite," she said as we walked up the cobblestone path to the mansion's front door. "The Blackwoods are particular about manners." The door opened before we could knock, revealing a tall woman in a black dress that looked like it belonged in a different century. Mrs. Blackwood's smile was warm enough, but her eyes remained cold and calculating as she surveyed us from head to toe. "How wonderful that you could join us," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Please, come in. The others are already gathered." The interior of the house was even more unsettling than the exterior. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the natural light, leaving the rooms illuminated by dim gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on the dark wallpaper. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow us as we moved through the hallway. The other neighborhood families had indeed arrived before us, but something felt wrong about the gathering from the moment we entered the main parlor. The adults stood in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when anyone came too close. Their faces held expressions of barely concealed anxiety, and more than once I caught parents exchanging meaningful glances that excluded their children entirely. The children themselves seemed unusually subdued. My friend Jake from down the street sat alone in a corner, staring at his hands with an expression of resigned dread. When I tried to approach him, his mother quickly intercepted me with a forced smile and guided me toward a group of younger kids who were playing some sort of board game in uncomfortable silence. "Why don't you join them, dear?" she suggested, but her tone made it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. I sat down with the other children, trying to understand the game they were playing. The board appeared to be handmade, with strange symbols carved into dark wood, and pieces that looked like they'd been crafted from bone. None of the kids would explain the rules, and they played with a mechanical precision that suggested they'd done this many times before. As the evening progressed, I began to notice disturbing details that my mother seemed determined to ignore. The portraits on the walls featured children who looked remarkably similar to the neighborhood kids, but the clothing and hairstyles suggested the paintings were decades old. Some of the faces were so familiar that I could swear I was looking at exact duplicates of my classmates. Beautiful artwork, isn't it? Mrs. Blackwood had appeared beside me without warning, her voice barely above a whisper. Family portraits have always been important to us. We believe in preserving the essence of childhood. "These kids look like people I know," I said, unable to keep the unease out of my voice. "Do they? How interesting." Her smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind her eyes. Children do tend to share certain qualities across generations. At 9 o'clock, Mrs. Blackwood rang a small silver bell that produced a sound far too loud for its size. The conversation stopped immediately, and all the adults turned toward her with expressions of fearful anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "it's time to discuss this year's arrangements." The children were herded into a separate room by Mr. Blackwood, a gaunt man who moved with disturbing silence. He gestured for us to sit in chairs arranged in a precise circle, then left without saying a word. The door clicked shut behind him, and I heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in a lock. "What arrangements?" I whispered to Jake, but he just shook his head and stared at the floor. Through the heavy wooden door, we could hear the adults talking in the next room. Their voices were too muffled to make out individual words, but the tone was serious, almost businesslike. Occasionally, someone would raise their voice in what sounded like negotiation or disagreement, followed by long periods of tense discussion. The younger children began to cry softly, which only added to the oppressive atmosphere. A girl I recognized from the school bus kept repeating, "I want to go home," but her voice grew weaker each time, as if she was losing hope that anyone would listen. Around 10:30, the door opened again. Mrs. Blackwood entered carrying a leather-bound ledger and what appeared to be a collection of old photographs. She set them on a small table in the center of our circle and opened the ledger to a page covered with handwritten notes. "Children," she said, her voice taking on a ceremonial quality, "tonight marks a very special occasion. Every few years, our community engages in a tradition that has been passed down through generations of Blackwood stewardship." She began laying out the photographs in a pattern around the ledger. They showed children from various time periods, all roughly our age, all wearing expressions of confusion and fear that mirrored what I was feeling in that moment. "You see, childhood is fleeting, but with the right methods, its essence can be preserved indefinitely. The families in this neighborhood have agreed to participate in an exchange program that ensures certain qualities remain available when needed." I didn't understand what she meant, but the fear in the room was palpable. Several of the younger children had stopped crying and now sat in stunned silence, as if they'd heard this speech before. "The process is quite simple," she explained, turning pages in the ledger to reveal lists of names, dates, and detailed notes written in various handwritings. At 11:15, the adults joined us in the room. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and her face had gone pale in a way that my stomach clenched with dread. The other parents looked equally disturbed, but they arranged themselves around the outside of our circle as if this was a ceremony they'd witnessed before. Mr. Blackwood wiggled in an ornate cabinet filled with what looked like medical instruments, though their purpose wasn't immediately clear. The metal gleams in the gaslight, and several pieces appeared to have dark stains that might have been rust but looked disturbingly like dried blood. "The midnight exchange will commence shortly," Mrs. Blackwood announced, checking an ornate pocket watch. "Parents, please confirm your agreements are in order." One by one, the adults nodded their consent for something I still didn't understand. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and her face had gone pale in a way that my stomach clenched with dread. The other parents looked equally disturbed, but they arranged themselves around the outside of our circle as if this was a ceremony they'd witnessed before. Mr. Blackwood wheeled in an ornate cabinet filled with what looked like medical instruments, though their purpose wasn't immediately clear. The metal gleamed in the gaslight, and several pieces appeared to have dark stains that might have been rust but looked disturbingly like dried blood. "The midnight exchange will commence shortly," Mrs. Blackwood announced, checking an ornate pocket watch. "Parents, please confirm your agreements are in order." One by one, the adults nodded their consent for something I still didn't understand. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and her face had gone pale in a way that my stomach clenched with dread. The other parents looked equally disturbed, but they arranged themselves around the outside of our circle as if this was a ceremony they'd witnessed before. Mr. Blackwood wheeled in an ornate cabinet filled with what looked like medical instruments, though their purpose wasn't immediately clear. The metal gleamed in the gaslight, and several pieces appeared to have dark stains that might have been rust but looked disturbingly like dried blood. "The midnight exchange will commence shortly," Mrs. Blackwood announced, checking an ornate pocket watch. "Parents, please confirm your agreements are in order." One by one, the adults nodded their consent for something I still didn't understand. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and her face had gone pale in a way that my stomach clenched with dread. The other parents looked equally disturbed, but they arranged themselves around the outside of our circle as if this was a ceremony they'd witnessed before. Mr. Blackwood wheeled in an ornate cabinet filled with what looked like medical instruments, though their purpose wasn't immediately clear. The metal gleamed in the gaslight, and several pieces appeared to have dark stains that might have been rust but looked disturbingly like dried blood. "The midnight exchange will commence shortly," Mrs. Blackwood announced, checking an ornate pocket watch. "Parents, please confirm your agreements are in order." One by one, the adults nodded their consent for something I still didn't understand. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, and her face had gone pale in a way that my stomach clenched with dread. The other parents looked equally disturbed, but they arranged themselves around the outside of our circle as if this was a ceremony they'd witnessed before. Mr. Blackwood wheeled in an ornate cabinet filled with what looked like medical instruments, though their purpose wasn't immediately clear. The metal gleamed in the gaslight, and several pieces appeared to have dark stains that might have been rust, but looked the Story 3. The Mirror's Reflection. The Henderson family's backyard barbecue should have been just another ordinary Saturday evening in our suburban neighborhood. I'd been living on Maple Street for 2 years, long enough to know that gatherings like this usually involved burnt hamburgers, warm beer, and neighbors complaining about property taxes. What I didn't expect was to spend the evening questioning my own sanity. I arrived around 6:30, carrying a store-bought potato salad and wearing my usual combination of jeans and a polo shirt. Nothing special, nothing that would make me stand out in a crowd of middle-aged suburbanites and their teenage children. The backyard was decorated with string lights that hadn't been turned on yet, and folding tables covered in checkered tablecloths that fluttered in the warm evening breeze. The first hour passed normally enough. I made small talk with Bob from across the street about his lawnmower troubles, listened to Mrs. Patterson complain about the new family that had moved in next to her, and helped myself to a burger that was indeed burnt on the outside and raw in the middle. Everything felt comfortably predictable until I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Standing near the back fence, partially hidden by the shadow of an old oak tree, was someone who looked exactly like me. Not similar, not resembling me in a general way, exactly like me, down to the smallest details. Same height, same build, same messy brown hair that never cooperated no matter how much gel I used. He was wearing identical clothes, the same jeans with the small stain on the left knee, the same blue polo shirt I'd bought at Target 3 weeks earlier. My first thought was that I was seeing some kind of optical illusion, maybe a trick of light and shadow that had created a human-shaped silhouette my mind was filling in with familiar details. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. He was still there, and now he was looking directly at me. The moment our eyes met, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a complete absence of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums like physical weight. The barbecue continued around me, people still talking and laughing, but I couldn't hear any of it. The silence was so profound it felt alive, like a presence that had wrapped itself around us both. I tried to move toward him, but my legs felt heavy and unresponsive. Each step required enormous effort, as if I was walking through thick mud instead of grass. The distance between us seemed to stretch and contract with each movement, sometimes appearing close enough to touch, other times looking like miles of empty space. Other guests moved between us occasionally, but none of them seemed to notice anything unusual. They walked past my double without acknowledgement, as if he was invisible to everyone but me. When Mrs. Henderson's teenage son Danny kicked a football that should have hit him directly in the chest, the ball passed right through him and landed in the flower bed behind. "Hey, you okay?" My friend Mark had appeared beside me, holding 2 beer cans and looking concerned. "You've been standing there staring at nothing for like 10 minutes. "You don't see him?" I pointed toward the figure by the fence, "the guy who looks exactly like me." Mark followed my gaze, squinting in the growing dusk. "See who? There's nobody over there, man. Just the fence and some trees." But I could see him clearly. Not only could I see him, but I was beginning to notice details that made the encounter even more unsettling. He moved when I moved, but with a delay of about 2 seconds, as if he was my reflection in a very slow mirror. When I raised my hand to wave at Mark, my double raised his hand 2 seconds later. When I turned my head to look at the other party guests, he turned his head to look at the same spot. The most disturbing part was his expression. While I was growing increasingly agitated and confused, his face remained completely calm, not peaceful or relaxed, but empty, like looking at a photograph of someone who had never experienced emotion. As the sun set and Mrs. Henderson turned on the string lights, the shadows in the backyard shifted and deepened. My double became more clearly visible in the artificial illumination, and I realized with growing horror that he wasn't quite right. The details I'd initially thought were perfect matches were actually subtly wrong, like a copy made by someone who had studied me carefully but missed the essence of what made me human. His movements were too precise, lacking the small imperfections and unconscious gestures that make people look natural. His breathing was perfectly rhythmic, none of the slight variations that happen when someone is relaxed or nervous or thinking about something else. Even his clothes, while identical to mine, looked like they had never been worn before, no wrinkles, no signs of age or use. I excused myself from my conversation with Mark and walked as close to the fence as I dared. The oppressive silence returned as soon as I approached, cutting me off from the sounds of the party like I'd been wrapped in cotton. My double stood motionless now, watching me with eyes that reflected the string lights but showed no recognition or intelligence behind them. "Who are you?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. He opened his mouth at the same I did, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard my own voice speaking words I wasn't saying. "Who are you?" The echo effect was so disorienting that I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a lawn chair. My double didn't stumble. He remained perfectly balanced, perfectly still, perfectly wrong. I looked around desperately for someone else who might be able to see what I was seeing, but the other party guests were absorbed in their own conversations. Even when I tried to physically point him out to people, they looked at me with concern rather than following my gesture. It was as if I was the only person at the party who existed in the same reality with my mysterious double. Around 9 o'clock, Mrs. Anderson brought out a large mirror she'd been meaning to hang in her dining room, propping it against the patio table so guests could check their appearance. The moment the mirror's surface caught the light, something changed in my double's behavior. For the first time since I'd noticed him, he moved independently of my actions. He walked toward the mirror with purposeful steps, his movements becoming more fluid and natural. I watched in fascination and terror as he approached the reflective surface, wondering what would happen when a duplicate met his own reflection. What happened was nothing. He stood directly in front of the mirror, close enough that his breath should have fogged the glass, but the mirror showed only the background, the fence, the trees, the party continuing behind him. There was no reflection of my double at all, just empty space where a person should have been. I looked at my own reflection in the same mirror and saw myself clearly, but something was wrong with the image. My reflection moved with the same 2-second delay I'd noticed in my double, and its expression held the same empty calm that had unnerved me so much. It was as if my reflection had been replaced with his, while he remained invisible to the mirror entirely. The realization hit me like a physical blow. What if I was the reflection? What if the person I thought was my double was actually the real version, and I was some kind of mirror image that had somehow become aware of its own existence? I ran to the bathroom inside the Henderson house, desperate to test my theory. The mirror above the sink showed my reflection immediately, with no delay and no strange expression. I was definitely real, definitely the original. But that made my double's existence even more inexplicable. When I returned to the backyard, he was gone. I searched the entire yard, checked behind trees and bushes, even looked inside the Hendersons' garage. There was no trace of him anywhere, as if he had simply vanished into the evening air. The oppressive silence was gone too, replaced by the normal sounds of a neighborhood barbecue winding down. "There you are," Mark called out as I emerged from behind the garden shed. "I was wondering where you disappeared to. You missed Mrs. Henderson's famous apple pie." I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to me. A perfect duplicate that only I could see, who cast no reflection and made no sound, who moved like my shadow but existed independently in the world. Mark listened politely, but I could see the concern growing in his eyes. "Maybe you should head home," he suggested gently. "You've been acting pretty strange tonight. Could be you're coming down with something." I agreed, suddenly exhausted by the entire experience. As I gathered my things and said goodbye to the other guests, I tried to convince myself that Mark was right. Maybe I was getting sick, maybe stress from work had caused some kind of hallucination. There had to be a rational explanation. But as I walked across the yard toward the gate, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Just for a second, in the darkest corner near the fence, I thought I saw a familiar silhouette watching me leave. I didn't turn around to look directly. I didn't want to know if he was still there, waiting in the shadows with his empty eyes and perfect inhuman stillness. Instead, I walked home as quickly as I could, telling myself that some mysteries are better left unsolved. That was 3 months ago. I still live on Maple Street, and I still attend neighborhood gatherings when invited, but I never stay past sunset anymore, and I always make sure to check my reflection before leaving the house. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I catch glimpses of movement in mirrors that don't match my own actions. And I wonder if my double found a way to follow me home, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever exchange we started that night in the Hendersons' backyard.